Hi, everyone. Welcome to another epic interview. I'm so excited. I'm here with Woon Tan from Podcast Publishing. He is, or he does everything podcasting. So really, we're talking here. He has an agency where he helps people editing and creating podcasts. He has a coaching business where he consults and coach people to be their authentic, amazing selves on podcasts and creating amazing podcasts. But I'm really, really excited to have him here all the way from the UK. Hi, Woon.
Hi, Paulina. Thank you for having me.
It's so awesome to have you. Like, we've been in this same community for about, I don't know, 2-3 years, right? We've been doing programs together. We've been creating like different coaching programs together. So it's really awesome to finally get the opportunity to nail you down for an interview.
Yes, it's
Yeah.
good to be interviewed here.
Perfect. And you can really see that you're the professional podcaster because you have like your ear masks and your microphone. And I'm like, I'm here on my earpods. It's like I don't, cruising live. But anyway, so today we're going to be talking, everyone who's watching, today we're going to be talking everything podcasting. And I think podcasting is a really important subject because it's becoming more and more popular. People, even the way we consume content as consumers is changing. Our habits are changing, and podcasting has become a really relevant world. So, Woon, let me ask you a little bit of a personal question first. Why
Yeah,
did you jump into podcasting? What made you go and say, I want to know everything about that world?
yeah. So my background was in insurance, and I was actually
I did not know
studying
this.
to be So I was studying to be an actuary. So I was trying to do a lot of financial modeling, setting premiums for home insurance. That
Wow.
was 10 years of my life. Home insurance, motor insurance, and risk management. So those were
I
what I was doing.
I would have not expected that because you're so highly creative and chatty. I would have not expected you to be in insurance. So something new I learned.
Yeah, so obviously then I found out I was a star profile, which is a people person, and I'm fairly creative, right?
Yeah.
So I realized, obviously following on Roger Hamilton's teaching, I realized I could interview people, and doing that itself is something that a star profile can do fairly easily. So that's kind of how I realized actually there are other ways to make money. There's other ways to build a career, and so I started a podcast. Not long after I realized there are different approaches and different ways you can build a career, and interviewing people, just like how you're doing it right now. Interviewing people is a good way to actually learn about the industry and start a new path. And so that's how I got started. I was very interested in sustainability. And so I knew nothing about that space. So I learned how to do a podcast, and then went out to interview founders of environmental tech companies in London. And then I did that for some time, and then I realized I was speaking to all these amazing founders, and they were so open to being interviewed. And then I realized, okay, there's probably an opportunity for me to get a job somewhere, and someone offered me a job, so I became a community manager for this brand new startup. I had no startup experience, and then I just left insurance. That's how I got started.
Oh, wow, that's really amazing. I did not know you were in insurance. And like the way I've met you and the way I see you present, and like in the environment we're in, you are a star. Like insurance would be the last thing I would have thought. Even like when we just talked about just briefly beforehand about like measuring your data and everything. It's like I would have not expected you to tell me you've been in risk management for 10 years. Wow.
Yeah.
So that's awesome. All right, so podcasting, like tell me, first of all, let's go briefly back into, I mean, most of us are familiar with podcasts, like, but I don't want to take any chances. We are going from offline to online. So let's talk about briefly, like, what is a podcast?
Yeah, so for people who are new to this medium, it's really audio content that is delivered. Usually, people consume it on a mobile phone. Um, but it can be, listened to on your desktop as well, on your laptop. But basically, it tends to be a series of audio files that are delivered, and you can subscribe to a channel. It's a bit like YouTube without the screen, without the videos, right? So it's it's usually just audio files that are delivered in a consistent basis through an app. So you would subscribe to a particular podcast, and a podcast tends to be a bit like a channel, a bit like a TV series, but it's more like a season worth of content. Some people do it in episodes, so each episode it could be anything from 2 minutes long all the way to 3 hours long. There's no rules on how long an episode of podcast can be, but these are sort of it's a bit like, a YouTube video can be however long it can be, right?
Mhm.
So podcast is similar in that sense. So people are enjoying all these types of content because it's brand new, it's open to anyone can create content, anyone can publish the content. So it's very open to a lot of people. And so um, it's different from radio in the sense most radio are live and it's only on, FM, or I don't know what's the other sort of frequencies, but yeah. So podcast is really a digital version of the audio content that you can listen to, and most of the time you pick and choose what you want to listen to. And so it's usually pre-recorded and then delivered in through an app. So that's
Awesome.
that's podcasting.
Yeah. Uh, podcasting in 30 seconds. I think we all know what we need to do now. We can go home. No, I'm just kidding. So tell me, do you find like there is a specific audience that is attracted to podcasting? Like, do you think that there is a segment in an audience or like a customer avatar that it would be ideal to be targeted in podcasting?
Yeah. So what happened was, I guess initially when podcasts came to the scene, it's actually a portmanteau of two words, iPod and broadcast. So that's how the word podcast came about. So it was actually Apple that actually brought about this revolution. But when they first sort of enabled podcasts to appear on their iPods, a lot of the people that were first using podcasts and listening to podcasts were men that are tech savvy. So those were the initial group of people that were listening to podcasts. And then what kind of the first wave of people were comedians, because they realized they just had to crack jokes. And so that was the first wave of people that were really using podcasts to promote themselves and to build their personal brand. But fast forward sort of 15 years, right? We're seeing all sorts of content. There's so much diversity in content right now, and it's growing by the day. So more and more people are creating content, more and more stories are being shared online through podcasting. In terms of the avatar, I would say that the like any other new medium and new technology, it's sort of trending downwards. So the younger generations are starting to pick it up, and then I guess the more and more of the people who are older are starting to be aware of it. And then it I guess you can say that it's been more available in the English speaking world, and now it's fairly global. um, I mean, it's very huge in China as well. I mean, for anyone who's listening who's potentially interested in the Chinese market, the Chinese podcast app is a very different beast. I
Oh
can talk
wow.
about that a bit. Yeah,
Oh, that's crazy. So, okay. So I think like, I mean, podcasting, you've just said, has been around for like about 15 years, right?
yeah,
So it's no longer a new technology, even though we are thinking it. The way I usually describe podcasting is like, it's a mix between a radio station and an audiobook, where
yep,
people who have a view and an opinion just share on audio, what they have. And what I love about podcasting is, and I think we more and more we see this, is that people who are busy or people who are commuting, right, like rather than reading the book or typing or whatever, they listen to a podcast. Like I listen to podcasts all the time traveling in the car, right? Like I don't listen to the radio anymore. I just plug in my thing, and I have a couple of really cool podcasts I really love that I listen, like I get really excited about. One of them is really funny. One of them is Instagram, which is like an Instagram a company. There's two girls. They're like from the town where I live in. Super young girls, but like they're just hilarious. They're teaching you Instagram, but the stories they tell, right? And like you say, like they're really engaging. And even though I have a team doing my Instagram and it's all, nice and pretty and I'm doing it all, I just thoroughly enjoy listening to them because they're connecting with their audience so much. So where I'm going with this is my question to you is what are like the key things that you need to consider when you want to go into the podcast, or who is the ideal person to be doing a podcast type thing, right? Like what do they need to have?
Yeah. So when it comes to podcasting, especially from a business point of view, it's a very effective way to build your personal brand because most people listen to a podcast because they are attracted to the personality, the person behind behind the mic, and it's actually the fact that you have this voice. And when it comes to voice, it's very authentic. It's very difficult to fake voice. It's very difficult um to sort of create a fake emotion, and people can really pick it up really quickly. And so when it comes to voice, it's much more powerful than visuals in that we always we can easily trust someone just by the voice, whereas like when we look at something, we still question it. um, so that's why I think from a voice point of view, uh, podcasting is so powerful to build a brand. And then I think the other thing to understand is that when we talk about podcasting, it's really your ideal sort of podcast audience avatar is really people who wants to share your content. If you can find that avatar where they are so excited about your content, that they are so moved by it, that they are going to be sharing it with their friends and family, then you know that you've nailed the avatar. And so that's when you have a podcast that gets word of mouth effect. It's very attractive to the right person that you're trying to build your brand around. And then it will help you grow your business, because from there people will be aware of what you're doing, what's your business about. And so I think for a lot of entrepreneurs, we want to grow our personal brand very authentically. And so there are many ways to do it, and interviews is a very common approach, because
Mhm.
you're really becoming a leading learner. You're positioning yourself to be interviewing other experts in your niche, and as well as people that are able to help your audience solve problems for them. So those are kind of the reasons why you want to be creating a podcast, and the steps to start thinking around what you can do for your
Mhm.
podcast.
Sounds a little bit like you're trying to sell me that I should be starting a podcast. No, I'm just kidding. I
We
love
can talk about
interviewing
that.
people. Yeah, exactly. It's like I love talking, interviewing people, right? For many reasons. I'm never ever like I know what I'm good at and I know what I'm expert in, but I'm not an expert in everything, and I'm never ever trying to, right? But also I love the power of collaboration. So our community is very much about collaborating and connecting with each other and going, okay, who do you know, right? And so and it is the whole world's rolls around who you know, not what you know, right?
Yeah.
In the whole world. Like that's how you get faster anywhere these days, is by knowing the right people. We always knew this when it came to like 10, 20 years ago, it was about the job. If you wanted a job, it's about who you know, not what you know. Now it's like if you want to grow your business, if you want to get better in sports and in any of these things, that's why there's so many coaches, mentors, and consultants around, is it's about who you know and not what you know, really. And
Mm.
so I love the fact that you're talking about like your podcast avatar, and that it should be someone who like loves sharing your content, right? We've been talking in the community about sharing like that raving fans can be also people who don't necessarily have purchased from you before, right? So when we're looking at the value cycle, we talk about raving fans, but that could also be like followers who absolutely love what you're doing, might like enjoy your content, but haven't got a need right now to be working with you, but trust you so much with the things you're doing that they're sharing your content anyway. So, what do you think? Where is like podcasting? You've talked about brand awareness, but in the value cycle from like follower to raving fan, where do you think podcasting sits really well?
Yeah, so podcasting, usually when we talk about podcasting, we're talking about podcasting that is free for people to listen to. And these types of podcasts are very well positioned to attract your followers, because what you're trying to do is really earn their attention with your podcast. So podcasts, you know, the audience is really to help build your followers. And but it's not just followers, right? Like you were saying, people share and they're actually putting their reputation on the line. So they're also just, they are more than just followers. And if you go one step behind, it's like raving fans, right? So it's kind of between the followers and raving fans. So those tend to be, some of the best podcasts that I know of. And I personally have shared podcasts even though I've not listened to a podcast, right? I saw the host, I saw what the topic is about, and like I'm so excited, I share it, right? And it's not even like I don't even listen to the episode, right? But there's so many podcasts and there's so many niche content that I think a lot of the time we share because we are so excited, we are so moved by even the name of the podcast, right? Sometimes. And so I
And the
think
person who
from a
sits behind it, right? You're
yeah.
connected to the person. It's like, okay, oh wow, Paulina's talking about the subject. I need, like, I do this all the time, not on podcasts, but on like Facebook lives and things like that. When I read the title and I see who is like talking about the subject, and then I go, hey, such and such, you need to listen to this because I know you'll get value out of it, right? Even though I
Yeah.
might have not listened to it. So absolutely, I agree with you. And podcasting is a beautiful way of doing that.
Yeah. I guess the other thing that I wanted to share around the 5 step value cycle is that over the last few years, well, since learning about the 5 step value cycle, right? Um, it's such a powerful framework that I realized that people are actually starting to use podcasts at the other parts of the 5 step value cycle. So if you say, for instance, this interview that we are recording right now,
Mhm.
right? You're using it potentially as a lead magnet, as something that you want to give away as a bonus, right? But you can actually take this content and put it into an audio, just take the audio only, right? And people can listen to it. And there's such a thing called a private podcast where it's not freely available. It's a bit like a unlisted video on YouTube,
Okay.
right? So you can't actually find it, but you can actually be given it, right? Like you can give it
Mhm.
away. And so these are sort of um, new ways people are consuming podcasts, and people are using the technology behind the podcast platforms. So in a way, you can use podcasts at the other steps of the value cycle as well. um, so to give you an example, I know of podcasters who use their podcast as a prospecting tool. So the
Okay.
reason is because people are so open to be interviewed, it actually gets them into the door. So they position their podcast, they pitch the podcast to a potential customer, usually a high end client, and it gets them through the door. And from there, you do the interview, but then you potentially have a sales conversation after that. And so they're
Ah,
actually getting
that's a
a,
really
co-
good way of, yeah, totally.
yeah. So if you think about it, it's not the podcasts are slightly different if you position it for prospecting, right? And so you can actually use podcasting to get prospects and turn them into customers. So it's very you know like people say yes to being interviewed. I mean, how often do you get a no? It's most
Mm,
likely you get a no only because people are too busy, right? So most of the most of the time, um, people say yes to being interviewed because you're bringing value to them. And so I've seen podcasts being used for prospecting. I've seen podcasts being used for community, because for people who are already part of your followers, like who's already in your community, you can create more content for them, you can serve them and add more value to them. You can add more value to your existing products, who are already paying people who are already
mhm.
paying you, as your customers. So if you think of it not just as a, as like an activity you need to do, you think of it as a medium, then it's a brand new way for you to add value in all steps of the 5-step value cycle. So
And
I
we
think
see this
that's
quite often in online programs, right? Like, so I'm pretty sure every online program am in where they have recordings, they have the audio file there as well if you want to listen to it rather than watch it, right? Like, and you have
yeah,
this like, and that's quite powerful for me because, like I said, when I travel, right, like I can't necessarily drive my car and watch the session, but I can listen into it to go and say, okay, what are we talking about, and what do I need to make notes on, and what am I learning? And
yeah,
I don't think I've seen. I need to think about it, but I think most online programs these days have an audio file attached to it. But
yeah. So in terms of the setup, it can be slightly different. So I've seen so what you get is not just the audio file, you get a link, and that link allows you to access the podcast on your usual podcast app.
got
So
it. Yeah.
there's a link that you can paste into Apple Podcasts, and then it opens a sort of a private podcast. So I guess the other benefit is that you can actually fast forward, and you can play it at times 2 the speed if the person
Yes,
is
one
is
hundred
talking.
percent.
Yeah, so I think that's a big benefit.
I was actually, it's really funny because they have always the speed up, but not often do they have slow down. And
Yeah,
when I like listen to Roger, for example, Roger Hamilton, he talks so fast, right? So 3 years or
slow it
4 years
down.
ago when I met him, I was like, oh my god, I can't keep up with you. Now I speed him up because I'm
Yeah,
like, okay, get to the point, right? But it's like, and people are like, oh my god, how can you listen to this? It's so funny. Like I was listening to a 4 hour session with Roger, and I was on 2 times, right? So I was like, I'll do this in 2 hours, and I'm like, I'm totally getting it. I'm totally listening to it because I'm so in tuned to listening to him fast.
yeah,
I had my husband walk into the room, and to him it was like, it's like chipmunks, right? He's like listening
yeah,
to it going, how do you, like, he didn't understand a word of what was being said, while I'm like, yeah, I'm totally understanding, but this is like, it's something I learned that through YouTube and podcasting and all of that, that you learn how to like listen quickly,
yeah.
and hear people in fast.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting trend, because it's now becoming something people do quite commonly, and the more, especially people you are familiar with, then you can actually speed up
Totally.
the play. Yeah,
Yeah, and I think it's really funny because people these days are like, oh, like, we need to do this really slowly, step by step. And I'm like, no, you don't. It's like, talk and I see this in so many online programs and podcasts where they like slow themselves down. And I'm like, why are you doing this? It doesn't sound natural. So back to your comment, you can't fake a voice. So,
yeah,
like you can hear, even if you've never heard them before, you can hear them going, oh my God, like, why are they so slow right now? This is painful, right? Like watching pain. So it's interesting. Yeah, I totally. But I have had this quite a bit now that like I speed up everyone only because I'm used to Roger standard, and I'm like, if I can
yeah,
speed up Roger, I can speed up everyone else. And if I instead of listening for it for like 20 minutes, I can do it in 10 minutes. We are busy people. Great. I get all the same
yeah.
information in 10 minutes. Anyway, so this is a total side track. Let's go back to podcasting. So for people I have actually a question because I don't have a podcast either. But do you have to pay Apple the platforms, Spotify and Apple and all of them, for hosting your podcast?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. So there's what you call hosting platforms, and then there are what you call distribution platforms. So the hosting platforms, they tend to charge. So you upload your audio files, and then they would charge based on how many episodes you upload, how many downloads you got. um so most of the hosting platforms would charge, but someone like Apple Podcasts, they really are just a directory. In theory, they are just a directory, and so they are really distributing these podcasts. So your hosting platform would connect to your the podcast directories, and so there are many podcast directories. So Apple Podcast is one of the main ones. Spotify is another, and then there are other ones like Google Podcasts, and then
Okay.
there are sort of fairly unknown ones, Stitcher, SoundCloud is one of them. SoundCloud is a bit different because they try to be both. Um, and then I don't think they're succeeding in that they become the hosting platform as well as the distribution platform. I think it's quite difficult.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing with podcasting is that there's no real sort of winner. There's no sort of YouTube for podcasts or Netflix for podcasts. There are many different platforms. Apple Podcast is still fairly dominant because they come pre-installed and people are very familiar with the app. So yeah, um there's no sort of fee to pay the distributing platform because most likely they want your content on the platform so that they can find users. And then I think their sort of business model tend to be either through ad networks, so they would monetize your content. They would find brands to publish ads on top of your podcast. So yeah, that's kind of how it works usually.
Oh, okay. Well, I have a iPhone and I've never ever connected to Apple Podcasts. I wouldn't even know how to do it. But I have Spotify. So for me, I'm like
Okay,
I'm
yeah.
listening on everything on Spotify. So that takes me to, if you are hosting your podcast somewhere, would you go with more than one distributor, or would you stick
Yes.
like, yeah?
Yeah, so the kind of the best practice is to distribute in all the platforms that are available, the top sort of 10, 15 of them. But as you look at the numbers, the after the top 4 or 5, like the numbers are very tiny. So it's like you get point 0.5%, 0.3% of your listeners are from those platforms, but you still get listeners. That's the
Mhm.
point.
Cool. So how do you distribute a podcast? So let's say I created a podcast. I've put it on Spotify and all the other great platforms. What do I do next?
So one of the key things that most people don't realize is that even most podcasters don't realize is that you got to market your podcast as well.
Mhm.
So you got to make sure people are aware of your podcast, shout about it. You want, especially if you're interviewing people, you want your guests to be sharing the podcast. So it drives traffic back to your podcast. So people are listening to your podcast.
Mhm.
So there are a few things that you can do. Well, actually there's a lot of things that you can do to get more listeners for your podcast. So one way to promote your podcast is actually be a guest on someone else's podcast. So it's a the reason is because podcasting is still, in a way, it's still fairly high friction because people are not aware of it, right? And you got to be, you got to switch app, and if you discover a podcast on a social media platform, people are just scrolling. They're not in the mode of listening, right? So they won't just switch over. So it's still fairly high friction, and most podcast listeners on average are listening to 7 podcasts. And so what this means is that it's actually easier and quicker to find new podcast listeners, people who are first time listeners, to listen to your podcast. So yeah, I mean, there are many ways you can promote the podcast, and the more you can promote it, the better, because it just means you get more traffic. And then the other thing um, to do is potentially anyone who is already a podcast listener of yours, you want to keep them listening. So you want to, tell them to subscribe to the podcast so that it automatically gets updated when you release new episodes. Different tricks like that you can help um, gain more audience.
Awesome. Okay. And final question would be, if you are about to start a podcast, how do
Yeah.
you, what would be like your couple of tips or tricks or to get people started? Like, what do you need? How do you get started? Like, what's the plan?
Yeah. I mean, I think getting good audio quality is fairly important. Um, but it really depends on your budget as well. So, this mic that I'm using, where you're hearing my audio from, is less than, what is it? I think it's about £90. So it's fairly cheap. Um, and it's actually really high quality in terms of the audio. So there's kind of next level up of mics, which are, you know, 300-400 pounds, but you don't need to spend those money. Like something like that would do the job. um, so you want to make sure audio quality is good enough. And even like yourself, you know, just using the normal iPhone earphone as a starting point is good enough, I would say.
Okay.
As long as you don't, you know, have all those you know, like movement, you know, like noises that comes in. Like as long as there's none of those, it's a good start. You know, most people uh I think overthink things. So you just want to make sure that you can listen to the voice and what is being said. That's a good start. And then the other thing would be to think through who your audience is and really plan out, you know, what podcast you want and why you're trying to create this podcast, so that you have some goals to hit and to achieve. Because I think most people are interested in the idea of having a podcast, but then they don't realize how much work goes into it, and so they give up quite easily. So I would say, you know, having a strong purpose behind why you're starting the podcast would help most podcasters.
Awesome. Okay. So I know you've come with a goodie bag for our listeners and viewers. You've shared with me, which I will also share at the bottom of this. So share with us, what is it that you are bringing to our listeners right now?
Yeah, so I have a podcast launch checklist, and it's a two-page podcast launch checklist. Um, there must be probably about 25, 30 different points. It's fairly quick. It's easy to um, follow through the process, and fairly quickly you'll be able to understand what you need to do to get your podcast up and running. And I hope it's useful for most people. I know people have found it useful because it gives them such a quick, clear idea of what they need to do to get started. Yeah, so that's the podcast launch checklist, and
Awesome.
there's a link there that you can just get the download.
Yes, so I have the link. I will share it after in the video. You'll see it on the top. Feel free to download it if you have any questions. Woon is part of the PR community, so he will be around. Just tag him into the post or your questions so that he knows to be there. But you can also, you know, that's the beauty of collaborating in this community. You can also reach out to Woon at any time. I'm pretty sure he is, I know that he's a very giving man, because I've watched you with all the participants in all our courses and how much you give and how much value you bring to the table. Thank you so much for um, being here with us. It took almost an hour. So this is what I mean. It's like I set out, I was like, we're gonna do 30 minutes, and then it's like, okay, let's have that conversation. Woon, thank you, thank you, thank you. I really appreciate you being here. Everyone, if you have any questions around podcasting, wants to get started, Woon is the man, literally. He loves working in all sorts of time zones. So I know that time zones aren't an issue because you're in the UK, I'm in New Zealand. So thank you. And yeah, I'm going to download this checklist and I'm going to find out for myself what I need to do to be a podcaster. So maybe you're going to actually, after how many years, convince me that it's a good idea. But for
Yes.
everyone, so podcasting is just one of the amazing tools, and it is an incredible tool and powerful. The one thing which I say at every interview and every session is pick one of these platforms. We're sharing these interviews so you can get a better idea of, is that platform for you. Don't get started on all the platforms in one go. You're going to just get overwhelmed and lost. So if you think that you're good in interviewing, you like talking to people, and you like the idea of connecting with others to share information, then absolutely podcasting is for you. Awesome way to get brand awareness and get connected. Woon, the one thing I didn't ask you is, do you have a podcast? And if so, what is it? Otherwise, I'm not
Yes.
doing my job correctly, right?
Well, yeah, so I have a podcast. It's called the Impact Goal Rush podcast, and I interview impact entrepreneurs who are very passionate about, you know, addressing UN SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And I believe that the SDGs is a really powerful framework for people to, especially entrepreneurs, to get on board. And I've worked in the sustainability space before setting up my podcasting agency, right? So I kind of saw how much needs to be, how much work needs to be done. But I also realized actually entrepreneurs are real change makers, and so it's not just people in the environmental or sustainability space that needs to take a lead. Every entrepreneur needs to be aware how they can make a difference. And so I've got a podcast around around impact. And so it's called Impact Go Rush, because I believe it's a go rush. We are in this moment in time where entrepreneurs are standing up and making a big difference. So that's my podcast.
Awesome. I'm going to subscribe. We have a new
Yep.
subscriber. Are you?
Yep.
Yes. So I absolutely love it because I'm with you. The sustainable, like when I first learned about the sustainable development goals, I looked at them and what they were all about, and I saw myself in them, right? So for me, it's exactly the same. Like everything I drive is to support the sustainable development goals, right? And to do my bit. And like you, I believe that we as entrepreneurs and business owners, it's no longer the large corporates, it's each individual entrepreneur that contributes to a greater world, right? And we are in this conscious shift. So I can see where Gold Rush comes from. Like I totally um, agree. Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much, Woon.
Yeah,
Everyone,
thank you.
we'll see you in the community. If you have any questions, post them below, and I'm sure one of us will answer. Talk to you guys soon. Bye.
Thank you, Paulina. Bye.